Since the release of Dr. Ratio, I've seen a lot of people comparing him to Alhaitham, which I don't think is a bad comparison, but I haven't seen as many people talk about how they are so very different. I might be wrong, but as someone who is foolish enough to pursue a philosophy education, I thought I might as well throw my hat into the ring of interpretations. What made me actually start thinking about this was the contrast in their trailers. Star Rail has done a lot of humorous trailers. Dr. Ratio's trailer kept up that humorous approach, and while watching it, I was reminded of a play called The Clouds by the ancient Greek playwright Aristophanes. This play may or may not have been responsible indirectly for the trial and ultimately the death of Socrates, which is the most well-known thing about him. Essentially, the play parodies Socrates and presents him from the point of view that an Athenian democrat might have had of him. Socrates was very outspoken and opposed to democracy. He was also a public nuisance because of his use of the Socratic method, which is a form of argumentation based around asking directed questions, which allow for the questioned to come to the answers themselves. Because we're going to take the storybook interpretation of this, we would say that he was hated because he wanted people to think and challenged the established ways of thinking and doing things. Dr. Ratio, as a self-proclaimed doctor of the mind, is like Socrates in a sense. Dr. Veritas, which means truth, Ratio, which means reason, is a very fitting name because through these elements are how many ancient Greek philosophers thought you healed the mind or soul. But Dr. Ratio doesn't present as a humble, homeless man who teaches people out of his love for reason. He's very abrasive and is an annoyance to a lot of people. History doesn't portray Socrates in this light, but the ancient Athenian Democratic Party would probably find little issue with such an illustration. There's also a lovely quote in Plato's Symposium, "How am I supposed to argue with the great Socrates? And you can argue with me, but not the truth." This is one show of how literature has presented Socrates as a symbol of wisdom and the truth. Of course, this made me think it's quite interesting that Dr. Ratio's name is Veritas, and that he seemingly has taken up the same symbolic qualities. He wants researchers to turn away from blind faith and embrace skepticism, acknowledging how little one knows. His trailer doesn't just match the goofy presentation of Socrates, he also has a line where he says that you learn to know yourself before you learn to know your enemy. One should know what it is that they essentially are. And there is a general sentiment in ancient Greek philosophy that is, for people, what is essential is the ability to reason and understand order. This is similar to Dr. Ratio's conviction that knowledge doesn't just belong to the geniuses, and that everyone can attain it. The word ratio in ancient and medieval philosophy is taken to be reason itself. In fact, Aristotle prescribes contemplation to be the key to living well, and what Plato calls the key to a balanced or healthy soul. Ancient Greek philosophy, particularly that of Socrates, was meant to be practical and not some far-out discipline meant only for academics and those not in touch with reality. Reality was one of their main focuses. Dr. Ratio is a bit of a mashup of Western philosophy. His banner is called Pantare, which is a nod to Heraclitus, who's that famous ancient Greek guy that said no person steps in the same river twice. One of his constellations is obviously a reference to Descartes, and his voice line during his ultimate is a reference to George Berkeley. So Dr. Ratio is likely not solely based on Socrates, but there is a joke that all Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. I would call him the Socrates of Star Rail, or at least his parody. So how is he distinguished from Alhaitham? Since Alhaitham came out, I've had this weakly held conviction that he's Aristotle-coded. It is clear that Alhaitham is inspired by an Islamic scholar of the same name, who did some big critiques of Aristotle, and Alhaitham's character is very influenced by Aristotelian philosophy. In fact, during the Sumeru Archon quest, when Paimon asks what he's reading, his response seems to be taken right out of Aristotle's On the Heavens, which was about what we would now consider astronomy. So like everyone else, he was influenced by Aristotle. In my research, I also learned that Alhaitham did work in astronomy as well. His work in optics, which he seems to be known for, seems to have sprung from trying to resolve problems between the fields of astronomy and optics. Alhaitham's character seems even more Aristotelianly inclined if you look at Kaveh as a representation of Plato. From the message boards in Sumeru to Kaveh's idolization of the ideal, he reeks of Plato's philosophy. One of Plato's most notable ideas is that of the forms, the order behind all physical things, which exists in a transcendental and metaphorical realm. They are what make physical things possible, but one could liken them to blueprints. Is it a coincidence that Kaveh is an architect who is often accompanied by images imagery of his own blueprints. Also, I just want to point out that Alhaitham belongs to the Haravatat school, which studies language and logic, and one of the things that Aristotle is most well known for is his law of non-contradiction. This he uses as an assumption for trusting reason as a path to knowledge and allows us to communicate. And if you're not convinced of this point yet, I'll let you know that on Alhaitham's splash art are words coined by Aristotle himself, most notably being telos, which means perfection or end. This is the completeness and wholeness which everything strives for. All of Aristotle's philosophy can be thematized by the idea that everything strives towards their own perfection as its end. Another strong example of Alhaitham's characterization is in his trailer. He describes his philosophy for dealing with problems as more time on contemplation and less time on execution. Contemplation for Aristotle was the highest form of human activity, and is what made for a well-lived life. You could also understand this as a content life. And Alhaitham does live a very content life. Despite his resentment for what he views as people's failures to think, he's not truly very bothered by other people, at least not to a point where it actually causes him significant distress. And this is largely where he differs from Dr. Ratio. Alhaitham does not care to heal other people, whereas healing others is Dr. Ratio's primary motivation. While Socrates is well known for the ways in which he engaged with the people around him and hoped for people to think and be content as he did, Aristotle is known today because of his contributions to science across a multitude of fields. So it's not necessarily that Dr. Ratio and Alhaitham are inspired by Socrates and Aristotle, but that they're inspired by how we view them and where we place importance on their ideas. Because motivation is one of the most defining and important aspects of a character, this is why I think calling them different versions of the same person is an oversimplification, even if we discount the fact that one of them seems to be more of a parody of a scholar, rather than an accurate illustration. If Kaveh and Alhaitham are the Plato and Aristotle of Hoyoverse, I would say that Dr. Ratio is the Socrates, even if a parody. Anyways, this character may be a parody, but the real joke's on me because I'm the one that decided to go down the rabbit hole of dissecting this character and duped myself into becoming a platonic Dr. Ratio simp. So please leave a comment telling me that I haven't read too far into this, or don't, but please be nice whatever you do. And before we part ways and you have inevitably liked this video and subscribed to my channel, I will tell you in Aristotelian fashion that whatever you go on to do, I hope you do it well.